Welcome to week 3 of our series, Visions of Hope, from the book of Ezekiel. Now, before I became a pastor, I used to be a Lutheran school teacher, and one of my jobs every year was to lead what was called the Outdoor Education Week. That meant taking a group of city kids, 9 and 10-year-olds, 5th graders, and taking them out to the country to a place called Wall Camp, and spending a week with them there doing outdoor education, learning about wildlife, learning about different plants and trees and things like that, learning how to use things like a compass and things like that. So it was a great week. The kids always loved it and looked forward to it, and I did too. Now, one of their favorite things during Outdoor Ed Week was one night we would take what was called a night hike. Now, here were the rules. No flashlights. You just had to let your eyes get used to the dark and see as best you could. And you were to follow the person in front of you, always. Never stay more than a few feet behind that person in front of you. And so I would lead them single file. We'd get outside in the dark, let our eyes get used to the dark a little bit, and then we would head into the woods and follow a whole bunch of trails through the woods. And sometimes we would hear things like owls or hear deer walking through the woods. It was always just an amazing time. Now, I could do that with them because I knew those trails like the back of my hand. See, I've been going to Wall Camp since I was a little kid. And so even though it was dark and even though we were in the woods, I knew exactly where we were going and knew exactly how to get the kids back safe. Now, I tell you that story because this week we're talking about leading and being led, following. Now, just a quick recap. What got us to this point. In the first week of our series, we talked about a God who is in exile. God's people have been carried out of Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar into exile in Babylon, and Ezekiel, the prophet, is one of them. Ezekiel's given this vision of God on his throne there in Babylon. And God is promising them that he is going to be with them. He has not abandoned them, and he is going to rescue them. Now, last week we took a look at a different vision, a vision of a God who loves. And we talked about how we as God's people often look for love in all the wrong places. We chase after love in the wrong ways in our lives, but God never stops loving us. He may let us deal with the consequences of our actions for a little while, but his love for us never fails. He is always there for us and will always rescue us with that love. Now this week in Ezekiel 34, we're given a different vision, a new vision, and it's of a well-dressed, well-fed shepherd. And as we read through the chapter, what we find out is there's a reason this shepherd is so well-dressed and well-fed, and that's because he's been butchering his own sheep. He's been butchering his sheep for food and for clothing. The flock literally exists to meet the needs of the shepherd, rather than the shepherd existing to meet the needs of the sheep. And the sheep, they're terrified, they're left to starve, they're weak and neglected, sick and uncared for. They've wandered away and are lost, and they're left lost. The flock is easy prey for wild animals because the shepherds are focused on themselves and not their sheep. Now, what God was trying to help them understand is that's what their leaders had done. The kings who had led them to worship foreign gods, the religious leaders who allowed that to happen and even became priests to those foreign gods in the high places right there in Israel. Listen to these words. This is from Ezekiel 34. He says, "Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. You abandoned my flock and left them to be attacked by wild animals. You didn't search for my sheep when they were lost. You took care of yourselves and left the sheep to starve." He was talking to the political leaders and the religious leaders, the kings and the priests of their day. Now, if we fast forward 600 years to Jesus' day, we find that nothing has really changed. The kings in Jesus' day, beginning with King Herod, who was king when Jesus was born, they've done all they can to satisfy their own needs themselves. King Herod was a king that was a puppet king put on the throne there in Jerusalem by the Roman government. And Herod used that power for his own good. He built palaces all over Israel. Do you know, in the Jericho Valley alone, he had 3 different winter palaces he had built for himself. If you go to Israel today, everywhere you turn around, you see a different thing that Herod built for himself. One of the most famous is a place called Masada. It's this incredible fortress up on this large hill that he built to protect himself in the event of war, in the event that he needed to care for himself. And it's just got incredible springs and places to store food and all this kind of stuff. And it was garrisoned by a military army. And as far as we know, Herod never even went there. And the religious leaders of Jesus' day weren't any better, were they? Listen to these words that Jesus had to say. He said, "The teachers of religious law and the Pharisees are the official interpreters of the law of Moses. So practice and obey whatever they tell you, but don't follow their example," Jesus said. "For they don't practice what they teach. They crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease the burden." And then there in Matthew 23, he goes on for about 20 more verses, speaking directly to those religious leaders and pointing out all the things that they've done for their own benefit, rather than the sheep they were supposed to be leading as their shepherds. Now, how about today? Well, without getting too political here in our country, I think we would say that there are a lot of politicians that have gotten very rich, taking care of themselves very well as our leaders. I just did a quick search, and the top 50 congressmen in our country from a wealth perspective, all of them are worth tens of millions of dollars. And by the way, this isn't a political statement, a party statement, because the top 10 on that list, 5 were Republicans and 5 were Democrats. And our religious leaders, again, if you do a search of the top 10 wealthiest pastors in America, they're all worth tens of millions of dollars as well. And it seems like every time we turn around, there's a new scandal with one of our religious leaders, buying a private jet with proceeds of some sort of charity or things like that. Now, there are, I'm sure, a lot of great civic leaders who truly do care for their people, and a lot of pastors dedicated to the flock that they shepherd. But even the best of us fail. Even the best of us fall short. In fact, all earthly shepherds at one point or another are doomed to let us down. Back to those night hikes I told you about. One particular year, I had needed an extra male chaperone to go with us on the trip. I couldn't find any of the dads of the class to come with. And so I checked with my old roommate from college. And sure enough, he was available. So he came along with. Well, he had a little plan, and that was when we took our night hike. As we were coming back, I would always stand at the door, and as we came back in to the lodge, I would count the kids just to make sure we had every one of them. Well, he decided one year he'd sneak one of the kids in through the side door, so my count came up 1 short. I thought I had lost one of the kids. I was terrified. You see, eventually, earthly shepherds are all going to let us down. That's why God makes an amazing promise to his people in the second half of Ezekiel 34. I'm going to read a section of it again, and I want you to just listen to these words. This is what the sovereign Lord says. "I myself will search and find my sheep. I will be like a shepherd looking for his scattered flock. I will find my sheep and rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on that dark and cloudy day. I will bring them back home to their own land of Israel from among the peoples and nations. I will feed them on the mountains of Israel and by the rivers and in all the places where they live. They will lie down in pleasant places and feed in the lush pastures of the hills. I myself will tend my sheep and give them a place to lie down in peace, says the sovereign Lord. I will search for my lost ones who strayed away, and I will bring them safely home again. I will bandage the injured and strengthen the weak." You see, folks, the problem isn't just with the shepherds that lead the sheep, it's with the sheep themselves too. We wander, we don't follow like we're supposed to. In Isaiah 53, it says this: all of us like sheep have strayed away. We have left God's path to follow our own. Last week we talked a little about how we look for love in all the wrong places. And the reality is, as sheep, we often look for leadership in the wrong places. We trust in things we shouldn't place our trust in. We dream up ways of living our lives and follow things like horoscopes or self-help books or the advice of friends. I could go on and on and on. And we look for guidance and direction in our lives everywhere but the one place we should, and that is our Good Shepherd. Now, Jesus also, when he came, recognized that people needed a shepherd. Listen to these words. This is in John chapter 10. Jesus said, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd sacrifices his life for the sheep. A hired hand will run when he sees a wolf coming. He will abandon the sheep because they don't belong to him, and he isn't their shepherd. And so the wolf attacks and scatters the flock. The hired hand runs away because he's working only for the money and doesn't really care about the sheep. But I am the good shepherd," Jesus said. "I know my own sheep, and they know me, just as my Father knows me, and I know my Father, and I sacrifice my life for the sheep." Folks, Jesus came as our good shepherd, willing to give his very life to protect us, to care for us. Unlike the shepherds of Ezekiel's day, or the shepherds of Jesus' day, or the shepherds of our day, who so often take the life of the sheep for their own benefit, for their own good, Jesus says, "I'm the good shepherd, and I lay down my life for the sheep." That means we have someone we can follow, someone we can trust, someone we know is willing to give everything for our safety, to care for us. One of my favorite Psalms is Psalm 23, and you've probably heard it a million times. But I'd encourage you to just think about a few of the phrases. I'm not going to go through the whole Psalm, but a few of the phrases in that Psalm. It begins with this. The psalmist says, "The Lord is my shepherd." Now, remember, the psalmist is saying that when there were kings and there were religious leaders of his day to follow, but he says, no, the Lord is my leader. The Lord is my shepherd. And because of that, he says, I shall not want. He's confessing that when we realize that God is our good shepherd, when we follow that good shepherd, we will have everything we need. He says this: "He makes me to lie down in green pastures and leads me beside still waters." Sometimes in our life, when we follow where God leads, it goes amazingly well. We have beautiful green pastures to rest in and still waters to enjoy. But he also says this: "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." You see, sometimes God leads us by green pastures and still waters, and sometimes he leads us through the valley of the shadow of death. But even then, we can have hope. We can have confidence. We can trust in the good shepherd who will literally do anything to protect his sheep, to rescue his sheep, to save his sheep, to care for his sheep. I love the end of the psalm. It says, "Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." In other words, the psalmist is saying, because God is our shepherd, we have his promise that goodness and mercy, the good things that God planned for us in life, and his mercy for when we fail, that is going to follow us every day of our life, here and now. That's our hope here and now. And yet we know where we're going. "And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Our future is with our shepherd forever. That's the hope that we have for the future. Now, one last Outdoor Ed story. See, another thing we would do in that Outdoor Ed week is we would go and we would go tour a sheep farm. Now, that was really kind of fun because you've got these city kids from north side of Chicago, and you're taking them out to a sheep farm. And we used to go in the early spring, and if we were lucky, we'd actually be able to see a live sheep being born. Now, again, for those city kids, watching a sheep give birth, that was a new experience. And an amazing experience. And sure enough, the one year we happened to be there, and when we first got there, the farmer welcomed us, and then he said to me, he goes, "I think you're going to be in luck. I think that ewe right over there, she's going to give birth any minute now." And sure enough, we had been there maybe half an hour of seeing various things, and he called us over, and we gathered outside this pen and watched as that little lamb was born. But when the lamb was born, what would normally happen is she'd start to bleat, and the shepherd would kind of help her to her feet, and she'd stagger a little bit around the pen, even though she had just been born just so cute. But not this little lamb. It just laid there. It looked dead. Immediately, the shepherd sprang into action. He tried to reach into her mouth and clear anything that might be blocking her airway. Then, when that didn't work, he lifted her up. He stood up and held her up by her hind legs and started kind of slapping her on the side of the chest and neck, trying to dislodge anything that might be keeping her from breathing. And that still didn't work. And finally, he put her down and dropped down to his knees, and he picked up her little head and put his lips on her lips and gently sucked out the mucus that was keeping her from breathing. You can imagine the reaction of the 9 and 10-year-olds. There were a lot of ohs and gross and all that kind of stuff. And it worked. Sure enough, that little sheep started to breathe and to bleat and eventually stand on her own 4 legs. And once the shepherd knew she was okay, he kind of wiped off his face and walked over and said to the kids, "You guys got any questions?" You could imagine one of the boys in the class right away said, "How could you do that? That was gross." And I'll never forget it. The shepherd looked right at those kids and he said, "That little sheep is precious to me. I would do anything to make sure she was okay." Folks, you have a good shepherd who literally will do anything to make sure you're okay, including giving his own life on the cross for you. Say it with me. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Amen.